Let me once again welcome you to this book discussion on behalf of the Observer Research Foundation on Nehru, Tibet and China, written by Shri Avtar Singh Bhasin. Mr. Bhasin has been the director of the historical division of the Ministry of External Affairs. But more important than that, he has done meticulous work in publishing original archival documents relating to Indian policy towards Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, ASEAN, and his monumental 5-volume collection of documents relating to Sino-Indian relations has given him the kind of familiarity with material to come up with a book that analyzes and assesses Nehru's China policy through the lens of Tibet. Along with me will be a discussant, Amrita Jash, who's from the Center for Land Warfare Studies. And we did have planned to have a third discussant, Professor Alka Acharya, but there was some miscommunication, and so she has not been able to be with us. It is entirely our fault, and our loss. Now, this book, as I said, is a product of scrupulous research, and Mr. Bhasin's judgments, they are sharp, but they are balanced and never out of place. Tibet, as you well know, without Tibet, India and China don't meet. So Tibet is where India and China meet. It is through Tibet that China manages relations with India. Also, because of Tibet, it uses its boundary dispute to keep New Delhi off balance. Often people wonder why the Chinese are not ready to settle. Often the reason is that the Chinese would like to keep India off balance on these issues. India is also the place where the most revered Tibetan, the Dalai Lama, lives in exile. Now, he had been negotiating with the Chinese for his return, but that has not worked out. And now the Chinese are trying to look at the post-Dalai Lama scenario. That's their goal. But in any case, that is something which comes much later. Bhasin Saab's book takes us to 1962, the War of 1962. Now, it begins from back in the 1920s and 1930s, when Nehru looked up to and admired the Chinese, and there was a statement of his saying that the future of Asia depends on the goodwill and good neighborly relations amongst Asiatic countries, and that India and China must play a dominant role in this. The problem is that the Chinese, when you say dominant role, the Chinese believe the dominant role today should be theirs and not that of India. Now, this, of course, is an issue. Now, Nehru's vision of an Asia with a resurgent China and India in the lead was surely a legitimate one. As I said, it is very obvious, stands to reason that if India and China can get along, Asia will flourish. But if India and China fight with each other, both will go down, and along with that will be the future of Asia. So Nehru's vision, as I said, was a legitimate one. The only thing is that it could not cope with the views of a man who played a monstrous role in the history of his own country, that is Mao Zedong. It's one thing for Nehru to have expressed that vision. The problem is, I don't think he ever anticipated the kind of character that Mao was, who presided over the deaths of some 80 million Chinese people in pursuit of his own goal. Now, Bhasin Saab has said that his judgment on Nehru is that Nehru was a moralist, an idealist statesman of his time, but he was also self-opinionated and self-righteous. Bhasin Saab again is very blunt in arguing that flexibility is a virtue that he did not display while dealing with China on the frontier question. Unfortunately, and he also said, unfortunately, he did not take into account the realities of national self-interest. But as he has pointed out, and again, the whole book has got many issues which relate to foreign policy, and he speaks of the successful foreign policy being one that forges convergences and manages divergences. By that measure, Nehru's China policy was a failure. The key development was the Chinese decision to consolidate their sprawling empire into a Marxist-Leninist state where there was no room for autonomous Tibet. That is the problem. Mr. Bhasin has pointed out that India's northern border was fixed by Sir Henry McMahon on a map without surveys and not delineated. As far as the western border is concerned, it was undefined. When India became a republic, a white paper was issued. There was a map attached to that. So that means it is a legitimate official map. That map very clearly showed the boundaries in Ladakh, all the way from Ladakh down to Nepal, meaning in taking into account Uttarakhand, it says border undefined. Now, of course, I'm not arguing that that was that the Chinese claim was right. All I'm saying is that both India and China had borders that were not clear. And a Chinese ambassador once told me that as far as Aksai Chin is concerned, neither India nor China were in control of Aksai Chin. The only thing is that China needed Aksai Chin more, and so they came and occupied it. That he was quite blunt in saying that. Now, Tibet, I will not go into the further details on this. Tibet declared independence in 1911, and they were independent all the way up to 1951. And Mr. Bhasin has discussed the circumstances, the 1951 agreement through which the Chinese literally were able to get the surrender of Tibet. Now, the book has taken us through the fall of the KMT, the 17-point agreement, that's the one through which Tibet surrendered. The book also tells us the story of Nehru's strange intransigence, meaning somehow Nehru, despite all the maps showing the border was undefined, he just simply took an inflexible stand out there. And so then Mr. Bhasin asked, so what is the way out? Now, this is harder to say, because in 1960 and in 1979, China offered to recognize the McMahon Line in the east as the border, provided India accepted Chinese claim in the west. But now what has happened is that has changed. The Chinese have now insist that unless India cedes Tawang, there is no agreement, and plus China will keep Aksai Chin. So the task of the settlement is much more difficult. But I think what he says is that given the existing, any meaningful settlement has to be on the basis of recognizing existing realities and the security interests of both sides. Both have to, this is something, as he says, when you come to border, it is our border with the Chinese. So we have to be able to say that we cannot have a border that will make him insecure, and neither can he have a border which will make me insecure. So there has to be some give and take out there. But I think the central point that he makes, given the kind of work he has done, is that the writing of history has been impeded by successive governments for fear of exposing the weakness of India's case on the borders, meaning many of the archival documents are still sealed. And Mr. Bhasin's blunt suggestion is open the archives in their entirety, let the people see for themselves what the truth is. So now I'll ask Bhasin Saab to give us his perspective on the book. If he can give it to us for about 10 minutes, and then it depends on him, 10 minutes my suggestion, and then we can have Amrita speak on this as well. Mr. Bhasin.
Sir, thank you very much for your very generous words. And you have already given most of what I have to say, you have already said. But in any case, I will say once again, you are absolutely right that this book is trigger of the 5 volumes which I had done earlier. When I went through the documents, I was much surprised what the story is coming. It is totally, absolutely different from what we have been told all the years and what we had believed that China was perfidious and Nehru was stabbed in the back. In fact, a very senior officer of the Ministry of External Affairs, he asked me once, don't you think China stabbed us in the back? I had done some study at that time. I told him, no, I'm sorry, not. We are responsible for our own problems. In any case, that being said, let me tell you what I feel and how I had gone. In August 1947, India had become independent, and October 1949, Communist Revolution had set up a revolutionary government in Beijing. Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, even before independence, had set his eyes on the leadership of the Afro-Asian world countries to bring them on a platform of peace, not as a third force, but as a force for peace, and occupy the available space between the two superpowers to avoid getting into their Cold War politics. He had looked to China, the other big Asian country, as a partner in that agenda of his. China had its own agenda, emerging as a powerful country, gaining the greatness of China, which had been lost in the past century, and end its humiliation of the past. As it happened, there was no synergy between the aims and objectives. Nehru's expectations that the two big Asian countries would join hands in the solidarity of Asia and for world peace were belied. He has started dealing with the new China, yet he did not give up and plodded along in the hope that China would be propitiated in due course of time to accept his agenda. The Chinese leaders have spent their better years of life in an armed struggle and had carried the ranks of marshals and generals. Use of farming came to them naturally. They had little patience and wanted the greatness to be achieved at the earliest. On the other hand, India had evolved from colonialism to independence through the act of the British Parliament transfer of power. They had learned under the influence of Mahatma Gandhi to adopt a peaceful and patient approach to all issues, both domestic and non-domestic. India failed to realize the Chinese plan was different from its own. The divergences and conflict in their approaches was visible even in the early years. On 24 September 1949, a few days before the establishment of the People's Republic of China, Zhu Dei, the commander-in-chief of the PLA, had announced that the common program demanded waging of the revolutionary war to the very end and the liberation of all territories of China, including Formosa, the Pescadores, Henan Island, and Tibet. Now, underlining the importance of Tibet, despite its small population, had said, we must occupy it. He underscored its strategic value as a gateway leading to Chinese southwest with the vast natural resources and its strategic importance abutting Xinjiang, Qinghai, Sichuan, and Yunnan provinces. In China's assessment, India as the proxy of the West could not be trusted. China had no hesitation to dub Nehru as the lackey of the Americans representing their imperial interests. India's own reputation about China became greater than before, since China's common program too had warned that the Chinese government would examine all treaties between the Kuomintang and foreign government and would recognize, abrogate, revise, or renegotiate them according to respective contents. Nehru's craving for Chinese friendship was not affected despite uncertainties in its intentions, since he considered it fundamental to his urge to lead the countries of Asia and Africa and the need to establish world peace. As he said on 12 June 1952, that the success or failure of his policies should not be judged from the narrow angle of India's self-interest, but whether it involved the success or failure of the whole world. Dichotomously, Nehru saw in New China the rise of Asia from the ashes of colonialism. He welcomed new Chinese leadership as Messiah, who would make China a great country and would also contribute to foster his dream of Asian solidarity. That China had its own doubts about India's policies and intentions was not realized in Delhi. China had perceived India as the Trojan horse of the imperial interest of the West. Nehru's support for Tibet autonomy was seen as his hidden agenda to preserve India's unilaterally inherited concessions and privileges in Tibet. It bluntly warned India, not once, but repeatedly, that Tibet was an internal affair and no interference in its internal affairs would be tolerated. As the Tibetans feared China's attack in 1950, the Dalai Lama had asked and India had assured him asylum. However, because of China's warning that his asylum would put their relations under dark clouds, he was hinted to stay back, and he indeed stayed back. There were moments when China's behavior towards India and Nehru personally was outright insulting. In 1952, it called India's resolution in the UNGA on the repatriation of Korean prisoners of war as Nehru's resolution and dubbed his resolution as parent of all evils. China even disputed India's claim to be its friend. Nehru did feel humiliated but helpless and kept it under wrap, and yet at the end he said he did not want to lose Chinese friendship, which was elusive. Similarly, China's disparaging remarks on the conduct of India's first general elections were ignored. Later, China even held India responsible for revolt in Tibet. Nehru made sure that all this remained under the tight lid of security so that the illusion of Hindi Chini Bye-Bye, which he had created, was not called into question. Despite Nehru's belief in the indispensability of Chinese friendship, he could perceive the odds against his expectations from China. His hallucinations about India-Tibet relations were unfathomable. He was reconciled to China's takeover of Tibet and wanted it to be done peacefully. He knew China had never recognized the Simla Convention, yet he insisted that China recognized Tibetan autonomy. He knew China had never recognized the McMahon Line, yet he insisted that it was India's border and China accepted. Recognizing the fundamental differences in their thinking and working, he remained smug and cautious and not to antagonize China. He even cautioned his officers that nothing was done to foster the accusation that India was acting as an instrument of UK or the USA. Yet China had no qualm in branding him their lackey. Despite harboring doubts about China's friendship, he believed China and India would create a vibrant Asia and wished the friendship of the two countries to endure and grow. Historically, friendship is one issue over which nations usually have gone to war. Territorial claims by one country against its neighbor have enormous consequences for peace and stability in international relations. Border represents the vagaries and irrationalities of history, and agreed borders come into being as a result of agreement between the stakeholders by adjustment of rival claims, interests, and ambitions at points where they are joined. The British were the most powerful political entity in this part of the world until the end of the Second World War. They had little hesitation in using force to enforce their will. The borders they set up for India were not negotiated borders based on the consent of the other stakeholders. The result is that Afghanistan is still not reconciled to Durand Line. Henry McMahon, as Durand Jr. had seen his boss enforcing his will on the Afghans, and by giving his name to that border, had immortalized himself in history. McMahon had seen at Simla his opportunity to go down in history by following the same tactics successfully and immortalized himself. Today, both Durand and McMahon are household names and subject of many books in the last more than 100 years. India on independence had inherited borders set up by the British. Even if China did not sign the Simla Convention, which set up the McMahon Line, and they had not signed it, but Tibet had signed it. and the Chinese who had big claim on Indian territories. Sorry, and I repeat it again. India's independence had inherited the borders set by the British. Even if China did not sign the Shimla Convention, which set up the McMahon Line, and Tibet had signed it, it was the Tibetans and not the Chinese who had big claims of Indian territories and asked for the retrocession, which it said had in the past been gradually incorporated in India by the British. Their claims included Sikkim, Bhutan, Darjeeling, Ladakh, and many more areas. Nehru later had said if India had accepted Tibetan claims, India's border would have come down to the Ganga. The problem of frontiers got derailed ab initio by Ambassador Panikkar. Replying to the Nehru's worries that Zhou Enlai, in his conversation with him, had not raised the question of frontiers. Panikkar recalled to him his own instructions when he was leaving for Beijing to take up his assignment. What were these instructions? Let me quote, to avoid raising directly the question of frontiers as it might give China an opening and might indicate our own doubts. Panikkar also added that while it was impossible to be categorical, it would be legitimate to presume that Zhou's silence on this point and his not having once alluded to Sikkim and Bhutan at any time, even indirectly, during the conversations, would mean acquiescence in, if not acceptance of our position. Nehru accepted this position, and that became the template of India's frontier policy hereafter. This erroneous policy saw its immediate application on 2 August 1952 when a note was presented to the Chinese Foreign Office listing 7 issues which needed settlement in Tibet. Frontier question was not one of them. Replying to Girija Shankar Bajpai, who was then governor of Bombay, the reason for it, Panikkar said that PM has finally decided not to raise the frontier question. Since it was apprehended if India initiated the discussions on the frontiers, the Chinese were unlikely to accept the Simla Convention and McMahon Line, and alternatively might offer to discuss the frontiers, which would be disadvantageous to us. Bajpai, disagreeing with this approach, suggested a note detailing India's frontiers were presented to China. If the Chinese did not react now and raise questions later, their silence note could be quoted as their acquiescence. However, if they raised objection now itself, that might leave us sadder but wiser. The same advice was ignored. Nehru had already in November 1951 declared in Parliament that the eastern frontier was clearly defined in the Simla Convention and by the McMahon Line, while the western border was chiefly defined by long usage and custom. About the McMahon Line, he said, our maps show McMahon Line is our boundary, and that is our boundary, map or no map, and we will not allow anybody to come across that boundary. Indian reluctance to discuss the borders was perhaps reinforced by the Chinese Common Program that China would, as I have already said above, that China would re-examine the treaties and would recognize, abrogate, revise, or renegotiate them according to respective contents. Nehru, having declared McMahon Line as India's non-negotiable border, became apprehensive of China's intentions. It was apparent that no part of India-China frontier at any time in the past had scientifically been surveyed and needed to be scientifically established their borders after surveys, but he remained hesitant. India bent on insisting the McMahon Line in east was India's border. In the case of western border, Nehru insisted that even if it was not marked, it was well known by usage, custom, and by the application of principle of watersheds. Yes, These are important inputs in negotiating a border agreement, but these by themselves cannot be considered as constituting an agreement on any international border. Even the McMahon line in the east was not scientifically drawn line on which Nehru was battering. Henry McMahon, who drew the line and also gave it his name, in October 1935, in a lecture on international frontiers delivered at the Royal Society for the Encouragement of Art in London, had said, and I quote, "For want of accurate local knowledge and absence of detailed surveys, it rendered it impossible to define large portions of it except in somewhat general way. There was yet another serious infirmity in the McMahon line. Firstly, though the McMahon line put Tawang in India, which India later called Northeast Frontier Agency, it was not occupied by the British and left in Tibetan occupation, which also collected civil revenue. Secondly, in 1944, the British had officially conveyed to Lhasa that it would amend the McMahon line to go south of Tawang, putting it back into Tibet. But it had not been implemented by the time the British left India. Thus, when India became independent, Tawang was actually in Tibetan occupation, but on the map in India. In July 1948, independent India too conveyed to Lhasa that India would be prepared to the adjustment of Indo-Tibetan frontier, particularly in the Tawang area. A few months later, in October 1948, the political officer reminded the Ministry of External Affairs to expeditiously implement the undertaking to consider the adjustment of boundary in Tawang area. As China occupied Tibet in 1950 and further negotiations for formal integration of Tibet commenced in Beijing, India feared with China in occupation of Tibet, China's frontier would come down to the plains of Assam, creating a security dilemma. India sent a military detachment and occupied Tibet in April 1951, ignoring Tibetan protests. China later reminded India that it had occupied Tibet after Indian independence. The western frontier in Ladakh, which ran along the Aksai chain, was undefined in the Survey of India maps, which India had inherited from the British in 1947. Subsequently, when these maps are reprinted, this border remained undefined. To that extent, it too remained an uncertain frontier and caused for worry. In 1953, when negotiations Tibet were scheduled, Delhi consciously and as part of the earlier policy decided not to raise the frontier question during negotiations. The negotiating team was instructed, should China insist on discussion of frontiers, to break the negotiation. As it happened, no discussion took place on the frontiers. Soon after the signing of the Tibet Agreement on 29 April 1954, Zhu had come to Delhi and in June had extensive discussions with Nehru. They discussed everything under the sun, but little on bilateral interests. Soon after Zhou's departure from Delhi, the Prime Minister in July issued instruction to the MAA, Ministry of External Affairs, to withdraw old maps showing undefined boundary and introduce new maps showing the boundary with a firm line, and said that would be our boundary in the future and not open for discussion with anybody. That it was an international border and needed consultation with other stakeholders was ignored. Nehru too approved T.N. Kaur's suggestion, also approved by Foreign Secretary and Secretary General, that while preparing the new maps, the most favorable line be shown and without waiting for detailed surveys, since that would take time. With both the eastern and western borders had become controversial, but in Nehru's perception settled. A few months later in October, Nehru had visited China. He had 3 rounds of talk with Mao when issues of war and peace were discussed between them, but nothing of bilateral interest. In another 3 rounds that Nehru had with Zhou Enlai, again discussions were mostly confined to world issues. It was at Zhou's initiative that some bilateral issues like civil aviation cooperation, educational cooperation, technical subjects, opening of Chinese embassy in Nepal, etc. were raised. Nehru did mention the problem of Burma frontier with China, where Chinese maps were showing some Burmese territory in China. And in that context added, even some parts of India were also shown in China. Zhou, in trying to set the doubts at rest, said there was no deliberate attempt to incorporate Burmese territory in China, and their maps are old KMT maps. And added, even in Manchu's period, this border problem with Burma was not settled. However, he said nothing about the Indian borders. Nehru, referring to the borders, again said that he had casually mentioned some of the anxieties of India's neighbors and added, we were not worried on this point. India's frontiers were clear, but his mention was in the case of Burma, because questions of this kind become a handle in the hands of enemies. Nehru said, yeah, that was interesting, suppose we publish a map showing Tibet as part of India, how would China feel about it? But then he diluted the whole thing, but also added, he was sure the maps are old maps and China did not mean it. In view of what Nehru himself had said, Zhou did not feel it necessary to defend this position. However, Chinese later gave a little different take on the discussion on this account. Chinese quoted from their record of the conversation claimed by Zhou that he had told Nehru that the Chinese, in revising their maps, would conduct surveys and discuss them with other stakeholders before revising their maps. India did not deny Chinese claim. Later, however, Nehru was not happy when China had said that in revising their maps, they would conduct surveys and discuss the results of their surveys with the countries concerned. Nehru expected China to accept Indian maps and revise their maps as per Indian maps. 2 other factors are relevant in this connection. Nehru remained reluctant to strengthen India's armed forces in support of India's frontiers, while China had a strong army in the PLA. Nehru from the beginning had rejected the idea of India as a strong nation based on its defense potential, even if he saw the aggressiveness in Chinese eyes in dealing with issues that faced it. He only suggested strengthening of NCC and the territorial army, which were not even combat force. He deprecated competing armed build-up as dangerous and instead believed that the strength of a nation must be built on its economic and industrial development, and therefore available resources must be reserved for that. It was a prudent policy indeed. But no nation could ignore competing needs of defense when keeping the borders in an uncertain condition, except at its own peril. One wonders at Nehru's reluctance to discuss the borders which were never surveyed scientifically and about which he himself repeatedly expressed his doubts. And these borders are the best guarantee for peace and friendly relations. That remained the blight of India's policy in dealing with China, which led to the avoidable 1962. Thank you all for your patience to hear me. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Bhasin Saab. And I think later on we can maybe raise some of the other issues related to that. I'll now ask Amrita Jash to make her points and ask questions if you want or make comments. Amrita.
Thank you very much, sir. Firstly, I would like to thank Observer Research Foundation for inviting me to discuss very pertinent book by A.S. Bhasin. I read through the exhaustive read and what I get that A.S. Bhasin's book, Nehru, Tibet and China, makes a very timely appearance, given the situations at the India-China border under the event of the Eastern Ladakh standoff, and 71 years to what China calls its liberation of Tibet under the 17-point agreement. So these two factors actually brings into perspective that what makes this book far more relevant in this current times. And I would like to begin by the author's own disclaimer, as I quote, that this book is of history and it should be read as such. History has no friends or foes. And this is what forms the baseline that, as a reader, how do you take in what has been provided from the archival research. Therefore, the book makes, as I read it, it is more of unraveling the character of China, a bit from the Qing to that of ROC and to that of PRC. And it derives it from the archival research, chronicled under 12 chapters, and puts into perspective the relevance of the past in the understanding of the present and how it predates the future in case of India and China. While 2021 marks the 71st year of diplomatic ties between India and China, what we found that the relations still struggle under the shadows of the past. And the testimony to the fact is the border, wherein the dispute has not just become protracted, but rather has taken a volatile character. Therefore, the resolution has become a far-fetched idea, more of a dream. So if I have to contextualize the very impossibilities of the current dimensions in the border dispute between India and China are rooted in the way Tibet factors in the dispute, which is on a larger scale, missed when we understand the dispute. While we see that the border dispute has often been argued based on difference of perceptions and mainly attributed to that of lack of demarcation of border on the ground and on the map, to that of difference over acceptance of the McMahon line. However, what is largely missed and what this book actually brings forth is the clash of perceptions over Tibet, which has been key to the present complexities. And this is where we have missed, or this forms the gap, and this is how the book actually tries to fill up this gap. In this regard, the very title of the book, that Nehru, Tibet and China, connects the dot and the linkage, wherein India's Tibet policy under the larger China policy has been guided, or what one can say still guided to some extent, by Jawaharlal Nehru's vision. So this acts as the central point. So as you read the book, what puts forward, because at the forefront of the book you see the word Nehru, so that forms the centerpiece. Therefore, the very idea that the book purports is that the Nehru's very fascination with China since 1927 has often been key to India's perception. However, what Nehru missed was that China under the Kuomintang, that is ROC, and China under the communists were very different. Nehru's idea of new China under the communists was clouded by his vision of old China. Not to forget that Kuomintangs were liberal in outlook, unlike the communists. This very principle formed the bottom line of Nehru's decision-making, while the PRC, on the other hand, continued to perceive China from the lens of the British legacy. So there is how one sees that the perceptions, how they came into being. Why India missed the realities of Tibet? As the book spells out very articulately, that the very idea of looking at Tibet only from religious and cultural aspect, the way Nehru reiterated culture, history, they loomed large in the discourse, and therefore their thinking. But the political aspect or the political bearing of Tibet in the larger India-China discourse came very late. One can say that it actually came as late as the date of being awakened to the 1962 war. Not even, the 1950 uprising, 59 Dalai Lama's flight from Tibet, but it actually takes 1962. The Tibet factor takes toll on India. While China, be it on the Kuomintang or the CCP, had been very clear on Tibet, unlike India. That's where India got wrong. The ROC was also very clear on Tibet, and the same legacy that CCP took forward. So therefore, India under Tibet perceived China to be benign, which is that, China can never act uncordial with you, or taking into account the differences it had in its political thinking. I think so that also didn't register much. Most certainly, the very fact that the CCP came to power through revolution, while India witnessed a transfer of power from the British, also made a lot of difference, which also again was missed, and the book rightly brings forth. It took as long as 1962 war, again I would like to reiterate, to realize China's intentions. But in the current times, we still find ourselves wanting that what are China's intentions. So what appears from this documented history is that Nehru fancied China and held it in highest of regards. But in case of China, the story was different. It didn't hold India in that high of regards. And the very fact that, India pledged for PRC at the UNSC is the testimony to that. This largely blinded the perception, as you see. The PRC did not recognize any linkages to India under Kuomintang, except for the medical unit sent in 1938 during the Civil War to the communists. So Nehru's fascination towards China by attending a conference in 1927, which continued throughout. But when CCP came into power, the interactions didn't even appear in any of the discourse. So it was dismissed, except for relegating it to the minor aspect that India sent a medical unit. But the interactions were much larger. What the book therefore hinges upon is Nehru's decision-making based on assumptions that overrided the very fact that China cannot impose any form of force, or rather China would not do any wrong to India. This we see throughout, that there was an overarching thought process where it was a one personality-driven factor, because we see the interplay of other decision makers, but that didn't percolate high up when the decision making was to be made. And this brings into perspective the myopic understanding of China over time, since the bilateral ties were forged in 1950, that led to misjudgments. So, as the author says that he raises the questions that wasn't 20th October not perceived by India. He raises the question that led to the start of the 1960 war. But the possibilities of negotiations on India's side, we also see that there was a narrow vision to that. So the negotiations that could have stopped any kind of the 1962 war, we are seeing closed doors on those aspects also. And the very fact that despite calling for non-alignment, Nehru's inclination towards the superpowers, and as evidently put forward, his letter to John F. Kennedy on 19th of November, amidst the 1962 war for help, portends that there was an overarching thought again that the superpowers are on side of India, but the Cuban Missile Crisis happened. So the calculations went wrong. The calculations to perceive India and the calculations to stand up to China. They were again, from the Indian side also, as the book puts forward, that there were concerns raised regarding the war, that can India put up a strong fight. However, successively we see there was the scenarios were dismissed, and the truth lies in the fatalities of the 1962 war. So, covering this perspective, this book offers a very strong case of the relevance of Tibet in the India-China ties, which has actually taken a greater, importance and significance in the current times, and one cannot dismiss this aspect. And the lack of understanding of the importance of Tibet, you see, has actually led to the miscalculations on the Indian side, and the outcome being 1962 war, which didn't even figure in India's then forecast. So if one draws from these archives, that as the book does, it makes a strong case, therefore, in pitching a primary read. More lucidly, it puts forward India's decision-making on China, which relegated the Tibet factor only to, as I would quote, in Nehru's views, Himalayas, terrain, and weather. So these three dominated, and that's where, you didn't see beyond that, and thus negating any form of hostility from China. So again, leading to the miscalculations. So if one has to get the key takeaways, we see that Nehru failed to read China's intentions despite Beijing's clear dispositions. That is what the book puts forward, that, Beijing actually unraveled its character, but we missed to read it. It showcased its intention. It was firm on what its objectives were. So if the takeaways comes, that I would like to state that the new China, or the PRC, was firm on its objectives in unification of its territory since taking over, since October 1949. Sovereignty over Tibet formed the benchmark of China's India policy, and we see that, how India's, the very fact of writing or misinterpreting or mistyping suzerainty to sovereignty gave China enough political space to maneuver. Hence, China's transgressions in current times are no different from that of the past. It's not a new story. Its objectives over territorial issues has always been very clear, and Tibet is part of China, and any form of digression from the principal position is not acceptable. So this was then, and this still looms large, or still acts far more stronger in current times. So this reflects that today, if you say China is assertive or aggressive, uncompromising, the character was still there. And it got far more magnified over time, as one can put it. So therefore, I would like to conclude with a very interesting finding, because as I start with the relevance of history, so I come full circle on that. Because the book states, as I would like to show your attention to, on 8th of July 1962, China accused Indian troops of violation in the Galwan Valley and warned of avoiding a clash, which was followed by successive warnings. And therefore, on 17th August, there was a firing incident which was reported at Galwan, for which China accused India. Now, putting it, over 50 years, as history repeats, on 15th of July 2020, Galwan Valley clash led to 20 casualties on Indian side. And China again accused India. However, despite its own wrongdoings, hence the relevance of history cannot be missed, because the timing, the very act, there is a consistency, only there was a time gap. So on that note, I would like to suggest that it makes an important read to understand how perceptions and misperceptions lead to disasters in foreign policy decision making, and how personality-driven personalities play a very important role when you understand not foreign policy, but rather foreign policy decision making. And in this case of India, therefore, it needs to go to the drawing board to reread China, and the current circumstances it makes it more imperative for India to do so. And I would like to end with a query that still remains. 1962 until today, has India adjusted to the new China? That is PRC, from Nehru to now. And on that note, I would like to congratulate the author on this voluminous work, and again like to thank ORF for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you. Thank you. You know, I can see from the clock that we have about maybe 10 minutes, so I could stretch it to 15 minutes. So what I'm going to do is I have a number of questions for Mr. Bhasin, and so I will read them all out together. Bhasin sahab, aap notes le dijiye, you know, so that we have an idea of the time, the control of the time. Are you okay to go? Should I ask? Yep. See, well, I have two questions myself. One is the question of you know, whether India could have militarily intervened in Tibet, because I have heard that Pandit Nehru got from General Cariappa a written statement saying that Indian army was not in any condition to do anything there. That is one question. The second question relates to post-62 situation, the situation which obtains today. You know, in your book, you have mentioned that the Chinese had proposed a 20-kilometer zone. And that zone never really came about because there were objections from the Indian side. The Indian wanted something. Now, again, we are seeing these no patrolling zones are coming up. You know, in Pangong, no patrolling zone. In Gogra, no patrolling zone. So, whether we should have looked at that idea with greater focus, meaning that is just after the 62 war. Then I have a question by Mr. K.P. Sharma, who's saying India is still paying today for foolish decision believing China on Tibet. How should India see Tibet plan in the future? Then I have Mr. Sanjeev Tripathi. His point is, when India recognized Tibet to be part of China, why did we not clarify with China on the southern boundary of Tibet? Don't you think it would have been a precondition for India to accept Tibet as part of China? That is the 54 agreement. Of course, many people have raised this issue. And then finally, we have Mr. Rangarajan, who says Nehru bungled the whole Tibet-China issue. When we have not raised defense services to protect the border, what is the point of blaming China? Our previous defense minister, Antony, had said in parliament that India is not developing border roads as they will help China to march into the country with ease. You know, that actually I can give the answer to that. That was the situation in the past. I come from the mountain area myself, and I know that border roads were not developed fully, but that situation had changed at least in for the last 25, 30 years. That situation has changed. So I think that question you can maybe, if you wish to answer, you do. But I suggest, I would request you to answer the others. But just remember, we have now about 10 minutes or so for your response. And you can also respond to earlier made by me or by Amrita. So, Mr. Bhasin.
Yes, sir. Regarding your first question, why we did not intervene militarily, it was not possible because Indian Army had been first of all split in 1947. Then for next 1 year, it was involved in Kashmir operation. It had used completely all its resources, and these resources were not replenished. And Indian Army was still not in the, and then demobilization had been done. Whereas PLA was a strong force, and it was able to even push the mighty American army of the North Korea. So army comparatively was not possible. Secondly, Nehru himself had come to the conclusion that military option was not available and it has to be done by consult. And since China is occupying the entire mainland of China, it has to be recognized whether we like it or not like it. We're not bothered about the type of the government. What ideology it professes. The fact that it is occupying the mainland is enough for us to recognize. Even the political officer, your second question, political officer had suggested we should leverage the question of recognition with the acceptance of China's autonomy and also borders. But Nehru rejected this idea altogether. He said no question of leveraging the recognition factor because China is an occupation. That is one factor which is enough, and he will not consider any other thing. So that is the answer to your second. Third.
Tibet, how should India-Tibet plan in the future?
That is $1 million question, and you should ask the Prime Minister. And regarding
then what Mr. Tripathi's question, when India recognized Tibet to be part of China, why did we not clarify with China about the southern boundary of Tibet?
Well, same factor that he was not willing to recognize this fact of leveraging one for the other. This is one basic point which he made repeatedly, both to political officer and also to the officers in charge in Lhasa, that we have to recognize China because it is the country which is the party which is in occupation. And that is the only factor he considered. And that is the factor which dominated his thinking, and he did not choose to think any other alternative which were indeed presented to him, but he rejected them. And there's another question.
There's another
last
question that I said about the border roads.
Border roads were important because they help both. After all, without border, you cannot reach the border, and without border roads, if they have constructed road and you are strong enough, we can also march on their road. So roads cut both ways. So roads are important. Even if you have to defend your frontier, how will you reach? Your army will reach those areas. I don't think there's anything wrong in building border roads. They are rather important. And it was the lack of these roads in 1962 that our army had to suffer also. One additional factor, apart from other factors.
And then there is this very interesting thing which you have brought out, the conversation with Mr. Banerjee, that Mr. Banerjee brought a request from Premier Zhou Enlai after the war, saying that let us talk quietly somewhere.
Yes, sir.
So repeatedly there were Chinese offers to settle the dispute, and there was repeated rejection on the Indian side. So can you comment a bit on that?
You see, Nehru was an adamant person. There was no place for any other point of view than what he had. There was also the offer by the Colombo powers, Colombo conference countries. Their offer was quite reasonable. Let us start talking. Their proposals were not a sort of a award by the arbitrators. They were facilitators. And they had coming back to, earlier he did not accept it. In 1964, Zhou Enlai visited Colombo. Mr. Bandaranaike asked him whether something could be done regarding 7 posts which you have in this area, in the Ladakh area, if they can be somehow adjusted and there's a possibility of talks. He said, yes, we are willing to do it, but let Nehru talk to us. We will agree to that, but as a part of our total discussion, not piecemeal. So China was always interested in the total resolution of the power, not step by step. That you accept what he says and he doesn't listen to us even. That was this proposal put to Nehru, and Nehru refused. Nehru said, unless in total they accept the Colombo conference countries' suggestions, I will not talk. So his being insistent, rigidity, killed every possibility of talks. And the same happened with the proposal given by Zhou Enlai to Mr. Banerjee. It was not even considered in the cabinet, not considered anybody else. He himself unilaterally just put it on fire. It was coming from the prime minister of the other country. It needed certain cool consideration with his colleagues. But no, he did not. What can one say about all this?
So the bottom line is that it is the personality of the man which was the issue.
I personally 100% agree that it was all his reason, his strong and rigid views. I may tell you, 1956, he advised UNU that you have problem with China, go to China, settle the matter by give and take, and don't take a rigid line, because if rigidity comes, then settlement cannot be made. And he himself was so rigid. In 1962, January 18th, Nehru met UNU in Varanasi, where he was on a pilgrimage. And now, UNU reminded Nehru, please go to Tibet, go to China, Beijing. Both Zhou Enlai and Chen Ji are very anxious to settle the matter. So please go and settle the matter. Don't take a rigid line. But then he rejected the very idea. There were any number of opportunities to settle the matter, any number of opportunities. One can count any number of them. But he took a strong line, and in 1959, 8 December, he said in Parliament that I realized in hindsight that our policy was not correct. I had doubt, and my ministry had doubt. And yet, it was decided to stand with our stand. And in time, we will become strong, and time will take care of everything. He knowingly that his position is wrong in 1959. In 1960, there was opportunity to talk it with Zhou Enlai and settle the matter, but he again refused.
Okay, sir, I think I will bring this to a close now. We have gone over an hour in this discussion, which is fascinating. It's an endless subject. After all, you have written 5 volumes on this, and we have only reached the year 2000. And so all of 20 years is still there. So I'd like to thank all the onlookers here for their participation and for their attention, and especially Amrita for her contribution to this discussion. So thank you all. And again, on behalf of the Observer Research Foundation, I welcome you to other such events that we may organize. Thank you.
Sir, allow me to thank you and the ORF, and also Amrita, for your presence and doing this study, and for the very generous remark that you have made about me. I am most grateful. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.